They say some doors stay closed for a reason, but sometimes it's not the door that's waiting to be opened. It's the truth behind it that refuses to stay buried. The rain had started just after midnight, a slow, steady rhythm tapping against the roof like a memory that wouldn't let go. And inside the small rental house on the edge of Mill Creek, Ethan Cole sat in the dim glow of a single lamp, listening without really hearing, his thoughts drifting somewhere far beyond the walls that surrounded him. At 40, Ethan carried the quiet weight of a man who had seen too much and spoken too little, his broad shoulders slightly hunched as if still bracing for something that no longer existed, his hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug long gone cold. The house wasn't much, just under 900 square feet of creaking wood and aging paint, but it was cheap, and cheap was all he needed now. Across the room, the closet door stood closed, plain, unremarkable, just another part of the house he hadn't bothered to think about, until Rex changed that. The German shepherd sat perfectly still in front of it, his body alert, ears raised, amber eyes locked on the narrow seam, where wood met frame, as if he were listening to something Ethan couldn't hear. Rex had been trained to detect danger long before he ever met Ethan, trained to pick up vibrations, shifts in air, the faintest signals most men would miss. But this wasn't the field, and there were no threats here, just silence and rain and a house that felt too still. "What is it, boy?" Ethan muttered, his voice rough from disuse. But Rex didn't move, didn't even glance back, his focus unbroken, his posture rigid in a way Ethan hadn't seen since the war. Minutes passed, then more, the kind of slow, stretching time that made a man aware of every breath, every creak in the floorboards, every drop of water sliding down the glass. Ethan shifted in his chair, uneasy now, watching the dog, trying to convince himself it was nothing, just an animal being an animal. But something about the stillness felt wrong, like the house itself was holding its breath. Rex let out a low, quiet sound, not quite a growl, not quite a whine. Something in between, something older, instinctive, and then he sat back down, closer this time, his nose nearly touching the door. Ethan exhaled slowly, setting the mug aside, the faint scrape of ceramic against wood echoing louder than it should have, and for a moment, he considered ignoring it, letting the night pass, letting whatever this was fade with the morning light. But Rex didn't move, and that was what unsettled him most. The dog never held on to nothing. There was always a reason. Outside, the wind shifted, slipping through the trees with a soft, hollow whisper, and somewhere in the distance, a loose shutter rattled once, then fell silent again. Ethan pushed himself to his feet, the floor creaking under his weight as he took a slow step forward. Then another, his eyes fixed on the closet now. On the way Rex watched it, like it mattered more than anything else in the room. He stopped a few feet away, his heartbeat steady but louder than before, a quiet rhythm building in his chest. And though he couldn't explain it, he felt it too, something faint, something just beyond reach, like a memory pressing against the edges of his mind. Rex's ears twitched, his body tightening for a split second before settling again, and Ethan realized then that this wasn't about curiosity anymore. It was about listening. And somewhere in that silence, something was waiting to be heard. The air seemed to thicken the closer Ethan stepped, as if the small space between him and the closet had weight to it, something unseen pressing gently against his chest, slowing his breath without him realizing it. And Rex remained exactly where he was, unmoving, unwavering, the kind of stillness that did not come from comfort, but from purpose. The kind that meant something was being watched or heard or remembered in a way that did not belong to ordinary nights. Ethan reached out, his fingers hovering just inches from the handle, then stopping, not from fear exactly, but from hesitation born of instinct, the same instinct that had kept him alive in places where hesitation meant everything. And yet here, in this quiet house miles from anything that mattered, that instinct felt misplaced, like a compass spinning without direction. He lowered his hand slowly and crouched beside Rex instead, resting one hand lightly on the dog's back, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing, grounded, real, a reminder that whatever this was, he was not alone in it. And Rex leaned slightly into his touch without taking his eyes off the door, as if acknowledging the contact but refusing to break whatever silent connection he had with the space beyond it. "You hear something I do not, do you?" Ethan whispered, his voice softer now, less guarded, and for a moment there was nothing but the rain and the distant hum of wind threading through the trees. But then, faint enough to be mistaken for imagination, there was a sound, a subtle shift, like wood settling under pressure, or something brushing lightly against the other side of the wall, and Ethan froze, his hand tightening instinctively against Rex's fur. The sound did not repeat right away, which almost made it worse, leaving just enough doubt to question whether it had been real at all. But Rex reacted in a way that erased that doubt entirely, his ears flicking forward, his posture sharpening again as he let out a quiet, controlled breath through his nose, the kind of response that came from recognition rather than alarm. Ethan stood slowly, every movement deliberate now, his attention narrowed to the smallest details, the faint scent in the air that he had not noticed before, something dry and aged, like old wood sealed too long, and the subtle difference in temperature near the door, cooler by a degree or two, as if the closet held more space than it should. He reached for the handle again, this time not stopping, his fingers wrapping around the cold metal, and he turned it slowly, expecting resistance, expecting the kind of stubbornness that came with old houses and forgotten spaces. But the door gave way easily, almost too easily, opening with a soft creak that seemed louder than it should have been in the quiet room. Inside, there was nothing unusual at first glance, just a narrow space with a hanging rod, a few empty wooden hangers swaying slightly, as if disturbed by the movement of air, and a faint smell of dust and time. But Rex stepped forward immediately, brushing past Ethan with careful precision, his nose low, tracing along the floorboards rather than the walls, and Ethan followed his gaze downward, noticing for the first time that the wood beneath his feet did not quite match the rest of the room, the grain slightly different, the color just a shade darker, as if it had been replaced or covered deliberately. He knelt, running his hand across the surface, feeling the edges, the subtle line where one board met another in a way that suggested intention rather than accident. And as his fingers pressed lightly against it, there came that sound again, softer this time, but unmistakable now, a gentle, rhythmic tap from somewhere below, steady enough to feel deliberate, spaced in a pattern that stirred something deep in his memory, something he had not thought about in years. Rex stepped back and looked at him then, really looked at him, eyes wide and steady, as if waiting for him to understand, and Ethan felt it settle in his chest, that quiet realization that whatever lay beneath them had been there long before he arrived, waiting not for just anyone, but for someone who would finally listen. The rhythm beneath the floor did not stop this time, and once Ethan truly heard it, he realized it had likely been there all along, hidden beneath layers of quiet, waiting for a moment when silence was deep enough to reveal it, a soft, steady tapping that carried a strange sense of intention, not random, not accidental, but measured in a way that felt almost familiar, like a signal sent with patience instead of urgency. And Ethan remained still, his hand pressed flat against the wood, feeling the faint vibration travel through the boards and into his palm, each pulse separated by just enough time to be counted if he chose to, the old instinct stirring before he could stop it. 26, 27, then again, a pause, then another tap, consistent, unwavering, and something inside his chest tightened as recognition brushed against memory without fully revealing itself. Rex shifted beside him, not restless, not afraid, but focused in a way that suggested he had already accepted what Ethan was still trying to understand, his tail low but steady, his breathing controlled, his entire body aligned with the quiet certainty that this was not something to run from, but something to follow. Ethan swallowed slowly, his gaze fixed on the floor as the pattern repeated again, each interval landing with quiet precision, and suddenly the distance between this moment and another place, another time, felt dangerously thin, as if the years between them had folded in on themselves without warning. He had heard something like this before, not in a house, not in peace, but in the kind of silence that came after everything else had fallen away, when men listened for signs beneath rubble, beneath earth, beneath anything that might still hold life or meaning. And the memory did not arrive as a clear picture, but as a feeling, heavy and unfinished, like a sentence that had never been allowed to reach its end. Ethan pulled his hand back and exhaled slowly, steadying himself, then reached toward the edge of the board again, this time pressing harder, testing the give beneath his fingers, And there it was, subtle but real, a slight shift, not enough to move freely, but enough to confirm what he already suspected, that this was not just a floor, and never had been. He glanced at Rex, who met his eyes without hesitation, a quiet exchange passing between them, one built over years of trust, the kind that did not need words, and Ethan nodded once, more to himself than to the dog, before reaching for the small toolkit he had left near the doorway earlier that evening. The metal felt cold in his hands as he returned, kneeling again, positioning the flat edge carefully along the seam he had traced moments before, and for a brief second, he paused, not out of doubt, but out of respect for whatever had been hidden here, for however long it had remained untouched. Then he applied pressure, slow and controlled, the wood resisting at first before giving way with a soft crack that echoed faintly through the closet, louder than it should have been, as if the house itself had taken notice. The board lifted just enough to reveal darkness beneath, not empty darkness, but a depth that swallowed the light rather than reflecting it, and with it came a shift in the air, cooler, older, carrying a scent that had been sealed away for years, maybe decades. Rex leaned forward immediately, nose hovering just above the opening, ears angled forward with intense focus, but he did not move closer, as if waiting for Ethan to lead. Ethan set the tool aside and used both hands to lift the board further, the hinges or supports beneath it moving with a quiet stiffness that spoke of long disuse, until the opening was wide enough to see that this was no small cavity, no simple crawl space, but something deeper, something intentional. The tapping stopped the moment the space was exposed, not fading, not weakening, but ending entirely, as if whatever had been reaching out had finally been answered. Ethan froze at that, his breath catching slightly, the sudden silence louder than the sound had ever been. And for a moment, neither he nor Rex moved, both of them listening in a different way now, not for what was there, but for what had just disappeared. Slowly, carefully, Ethan leaned forward and angled his gaze into the darkness, his eyes adjusting just enough to make out the faint outline of a narrow ladder descending into the space below, its rungs worn but intact, leading down into a place that had clearly been meant to be entered, just not by anyone who had lived here recently. He sat back on his heels, the weight of the moment settling over him in a way that felt both heavy and strangely calm, and he understood then that this was not an accident, not a coincidence, and not something Rex had imagined. This had been waiting, patiently, quietly, for someone who would finally choose to look beneath the surface instead of walking away. And for reasons he could not fully explain, Ethan knew he was not here to ignore it. The silence that followed felt different, not empty but settled, like something had completed its purpose and stepped back, leaving the space open in a way that demanded a response. And Ethan remained kneeling there for several seconds, his eyes fixed on the dark opening beneath the lifted board, his mind moving through possibilities that all felt equally distant and immediate at the same time. The faint scent rising from below carried a trace of metal and aged air, the kind that only formed in places untouched by light for years, and it stirred something quiet in his chest, not fear, not curiosity alone, but a recognition that this was a threshold, the kind that separated what was known from what had been deliberately hidden. Rex shifted his weight slightly, stepping closer to the edge but still holding back, his training evident in the restraint, waiting for Ethan to make the first move, and when their eyes met again, there was no urgency in the dog's gaze, only a steady expectation, as if he already understood that whatever lay below was not meant to be avoided. Ethan reached for the flashlight resting near his tools, the beam flickering once before stabilizing into a narrow column of pale light, and he angled it downward, illuminating the first few rungs of the ladder, each one worn smooth by use that had clearly stopped long ago, the wood aged but solid, leading down into a space that swallowed the light just beyond its reach. He exhaled slowly, then shifted his position, lowering one boot carefully onto the top rung, testing it with measured pressure before committing his weight, the old instincts guiding every movement, deliberate, controlled, respectful of the unknown rather than reckless against it. The ladder held without protest, and Ethan began his descent, one step at a time, the faint creak of wood echoing softly around him, each sound amplified by the enclosed space, while above, Rex remained at the opening, his silhouette framed by the dim light of the room beyond, watching without hesitation, ready but unwilling to rush ahead. The air grew cooler as Ethan moved lower, the scent of time thickening, carrying with it a stillness that felt preserved rather than abandoned. And when his boots finally touched the ground below, the beam of his flashlight revealed a narrow chamber carved not by accident but by design, its walls reinforced with aged timber, its floor covered in a thin layer of dust that had not been disturbed in years. He paused there, letting his eyes adjust, sweeping the light slowly from one side to the other, and what emerged from the darkness was not chaos or ruin, but order, quiet and intentional, as if someone had once lived or worked here with purpose. Against one wall stood a small wooden table, its surface holding a few scattered objects, a metal canteen, a folded piece of cloth, and something rectangular partially obscured by dust, while along the opposite side, a narrow shelf held a row of items placed with care, each one positioned as though it still mattered. Ethan stepped forward cautiously, the faint sound of his boots against the ground breaking the long silence in a way that felt almost intrusive, and as the beam of light moved across the table again, it caught on the edge of the rectangular object, revealing it to be an old radio unit, its casing worn but intact, a small dial set into the front, frozen in place as if time itself had stopped the moment it was last used. He felt something tighten in his chest at the sight of it, a subtle pull that reached beyond logic, and he moved closer, brushing a thin layer of dust from its surface with the back of his hand, revealing markings that had faded but not disappeared, numbers and letters etched in a style he recognized without fully understanding why. Above him, Rex let out a soft, single sound, not a bark, not a warning, but something closer to acknowledgement, and Ethan glanced upward briefly before returning his focus to the room, to the quiet arrangement of objects that did not feel abandoned so much as waiting. The stillness here was not empty. It was held, as if whatever story had begun in this place had never truly ended, only paused, and now, with the light breaking through again, it had begun to breathe once more. The longer Ethan stood in that hidden room, the more the silence began to feel like a presence rather than an absence, something layered into the walls themselves, as if the space had absorbed every moment that had ever happened there, and was now holding it all in quiet suspension, waiting for someone willing enough to listen without rushing to understand, and he found himself moving slower because of it, his steps measured, his breathing steady, as though any sudden movement might disturb something delicate that had remained undisturbed for years. The beam of his flashlight drifted across the wooden table again, settling this time on the folded cloth, and he reached out, lifting it carefully, revealing beneath it a small metal tag attached to a worn leather cord, the kind used in service, simple, functional, and unmistakably familiar. His fingers paused just above it before he picked it up, the weight of it surprisingly solid in his hand, and though the surface was dulled with age, the engraved letters were still visible, etched deep enough to survive time itself. Ethan tilted the tag toward the light, his eyes narrowing slightly as he read the name, and for a moment, the room seemed to shift around him, the quiet pressing closer as recognition settled in with a slow, undeniable certainty. It was not just a name, it was a memory, one he had not expected to find here, in a place he had never known existed, and yet there it was, bridging a gap between past and present that suddenly felt far smaller than it should have been. Above him, Rex shifted again, a soft movement near the opening, followed by the faint sound of his paws adjusting position, but he did not descend, did not interrupt, as if he understood that this part belonged to Ethan alone. Ethan lowered the tag slightly, his gaze drifting back to the radio on the table, and something about the way the two objects sat in the same space felt intentional, like pieces of a message arranged with care rather than scattered by chance. He stepped closer to the radio, brushing more dust from its surface, revealing a small dial set to a frequency that had not moved in years, and beside it, a narrow slot where a thin strip of paper had been tucked, barely visible until now. He reached for it slowly, easing it free without tearing it, and unfolded it with careful hands, the paper brittle but intact, its edges yellowed with age. The writing on it was neat but firm, the kind that carried purpose in every stroke, and though time had softened the ink slightly, the words remained clear enough to read. Ethan's eyes moved across the lines, and, as they did, his breathing shifted, not faster, not heavier, but deeper, as if something long held beneath the surface had finally found its way upward. The message was not long, but it was precise, each word placed with intention, not meant to explain everything, but to guide whoever found it towards something more. It spoke of waiting, of signals sent into silence, of the hope that someone who understood would eventually hear them. And though it never named a place or a time directly, it carried a familiarity that Ethan could not ignore, a tone that echoed something he had known before, something he had once been part of. He lowered the paper slightly, his gaze unfocused for a moment as memory and present began to overlap, and in that quiet convergence, he understood that this was not just a hidden room, not just a forgotten space beneath a house no one cared about, but a continuation of something unfinished, something that had not been lost, only delayed. Rex let out a soft exhale above, almost like a sigh, and Ethan glanced upward again, a faint nod passing between them, subtle but certain, as if both of them had reached the same understanding from different paths. The tapping that had led them here was gone, but in its place was something clearer, something steadier, not a signal calling out anymore, but a message already delivered, waiting now to be followed through. Ethan folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his jacket, then looked once more at the radio, his hand hovering just above it, not touching yet, but close enough to feel the quiet gravity of what it might hold. The room no longer felt like a mystery to solve, but a story that had chosen its listener, and for the first time since he had arrived in this house, Ethan did not feel like he was passing through. He felt like he had been brought here for a reason. The space seemed to hold its breath again as Ethan finally let his hand settle on the radio, his fingers resting lightly against the worn metal surface as if testing whether it still belonged to this world or remained anchored somewhere deeper, somewhere untouched by time. And for a moment he did nothing, simply standing there in the quiet weight of everything he had just uncovered, feeling the faint echo of the past pressing gently against the present. The paper in his pocket felt heavier now, not because of its weight, but because of what it carried, and the name on the tag still lingered in his mind, not as a shock anymore, but as a truth slowly unfolding, one that demanded to be understood rather than dismissed. Above him, Rex shifted again, a soft scrape of claws against wood, followed by a low breath that carried neither urgency nor fear, only patience, the same patience that had guided him to this exact spot, at this exact moment. Ethan inhaled slowly, steadying himself, then reached for the dial on the front of the radio, his fingers brushing against it with care before applying the slightest pressure, testing whether it would move after all these years. At first, it resisted, stiff from disuse, but with a gentle turn, it gave way, shifting just enough to break whatever stillness had held it in place. And as it moved, something changed in the air, subtle but undeniable, like a thread being pulled tight after years of slack. He paused, listening, not with his ears alone, but with the same quiet attention that had brought him here, and for a second there was nothing, only the faint hum of silence pressing against the edges of his awareness. But then, beneath that silence, something stirred. It was not loud, not even clear at first, just a faint whisper of sound, like static trying to remember how to become a voice, rising slowly from the speaker as if it had been waiting for permission to exist again. Ethan leaned in slightly, his brow tightening as he adjusted the dial another fraction, and the sound sharpened, still fragile, still distant, but undeniably present now, carrying with it a rhythm that felt almost human in its persistence. Rex let out a soft, low sound above, not alarmed, but attentive, his ears angled toward the opening as if he could hear more than Ethan could, as if he understood what was trying to reach through the static before it fully formed. The signal flickered, faded, then returned again, stronger this time, and within it, there was something else, something buried. Just beneath the noise, a pattern, a cadence that did not belong to randomness, and Ethan felt his chest tighten as recognition brushed against him once more, closer now, clearer than before. He adjusted the dial again, slower this time, his movements guided by instinct rather than logic, and as the frequency settled into place, the static shifted, thinning just enough to allow something through, not a full voice yet, not words he could understand, but the shape of one, the presence of something that had once been spoken and was now finding its way back. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief second, letting the sound settle around him, letting it move through the quiet spaces inside him that had long been closed off. And when he opened them again, there was no hesitation left, only a steady awareness that whatever this was, it had not been left here by accident. The room felt different now, not just a hidden place beneath a house, but a point of connection, a bridge between moments that had never fully separated, and Ethan realized then that the tapping had not been a warning, nor a coincidence, but a signal, a final attempt to reach someone who would understand what to do next. He rested his hand more firmly against the radio, not forcing it, not rushing it, but staying with it, allowing the fragile signal to build, to gather strength in its own time. And as the faint outline of a voice began to take shape within the static, he understood that this was not about uncovering something forgotten. It was about finishing something that had been waiting far too long to be heard. The sound did not arrive all at once, but in fragments, like something piecing itself back together across distance and time, and Ethan remained still as the faint shape of a voice began to form within the static, not clear enough to understand yet, but unmistakably human in its rhythm, its pauses, its quiet persistence. He adjusted the dial again, just slightly, his movements guided less by thought now and more by a feeling that had settled deep within him, a recognition that went beyond logic, and as the frequency shifted, the signal steadied, the static thinning just enough to allow something more to come through. Rex lowered himself at the edge of the opening above, his body stretched forward, ears fixed, listening with an intensity that mirrored Ethan's own focus, and the space between them felt connected in a way that did not need explanation, as if both of them had been led here by the same unseen thread. The voice flickered again, stronger this time, and within it, there was a cadence that carried familiarity, not because Ethan could place it immediately, but because something in it resonated with a part of him that had not been touched in years. He leaned closer to the radio, his breath slow, controlled, his hand resting lightly against the table as if anchoring himself in the moment. And then, through the fading static, a single word emerged, soft and broken, but real. Ethan froze. The word was not random. It was not noise shaped by coincidence. It was his name, not spoken clearly, not with strength, but enough to be recognized, enough to send a quiet shock through him that settled deeper than any sudden reaction. He did not move, did not speak, simply listened as the voice tried again, the signal wavering but determined, each attempt carrying the same quiet intention, as if reaching across something that refused to fully let go. Ethan's mind moved quickly now, not in panic, but in alignment, pulling together the fragments he had already found, the tag, the note, the placement of everything in this hidden room, and slowly, the shape of the truth began to form, not as a revelation that arrived all at once, but as a realization that had been building since the moment Rex first sat in front of that closet. The name on the tag, the tone of the message, the pattern of the signal, they all pointed to the same place, the same time, the same connection that Ethan had spent years trying not to revisit. He swallowed, his throat tight, his eyes fixed on the radio as the voice continued to break through in pieces, fragments of sound that carried meaning even when the words were not fully clear, and within those fragments, there was something else, something that felt less like a call for help and more like a message that had been waiting to be delivered. Rex let out a low, steady breath above, then shifted, placing one paw onto the first rung of the ladder, not descending fully, but moving closer, as if understanding that the distance between them was no longer necessary. Ethan reached out slowly, his fingers resting more firmly against the radio now, not to control it, but to stay connected to whatever was passing through it. And as the signal strengthened again, the voice came through more clearly, still fragile, still interrupted by static, but carrying enough clarity to be understood in pieces. It was not a warning. It was not fear. It was something else entirely. Something calm. Something resolved. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment, letting the sound settle inside him. And when he opened them again, there was no confusion left, no doubt about what this was or why it had found him. The room felt warmer somehow, not in temperature, but in presence, as if the silence that had once filled it had finally given way to something complete. And in that quiet, steady connection, Ethan understood that this was not a mystery meant to be solved, but a message meant to be received, one that had waited long enough for someone who would finally stay and listen. The voice did not rush, and that was what made it feel real, not a burst of sound forcing its way through the static, but something patient, something that had learned how to wait. And as Ethan leaned closer, the fragments began to settle into meaning, not perfect, not uninterrupted, but enough to be understood by someone who already knew how to listen between what was said and what was left unsaid. The name came again, clearer this time, followed by a pause that felt intentional, as if the speaker knew exactly who would be on the other side, as if the message had been shaped with Ethan in mind long before he ever stepped into this house. His chest tightened, not from fear, but from recognition, the kind that did not need confirmation because it had already taken root the moment he saw the tag, the moment he read the note, the moment Rex refused to leave that door. The voice continued, breaking through in short, measured lines, each one carrying a weight that went beyond the words themselves, and Ethan realized that it was not trying to tell a story, it was trying to complete one. There were references he understood immediately, small details that only someone from his past would know, phrases that had once been spoken in entirely different places, under entirely different skies, and hearing them now, in this quiet hidden room beneath an ordinary house, felt less like coincidence and more like something that had been carefully arranged over time. Rex moved down one rung of the ladder, then another, until he stood just behind Ethan, his presence steady and grounding, his breath warm against the still air of the room. And for the first time since the signal began, Ethan reached back slightly, resting his hand against the dog's shoulder without looking away from the radio, a silent acknowledgement of the path that had brought them here together. The message grew clearer with each passing second, not stronger in volume, but steadier in form, as if the connection had finally found its rhythm, and within it, there was no urgency, no fear, only a quiet certainty that whatever needed to be said was being said exactly as it was meant to be. Ethan listened without interruption, without trying to control the moment, allowing the words to arrive as they would. And as they did, something inside him began to shift, not suddenly, not dramatically, but in a slow, steady way that felt more real than any sharp reaction ever could. The voice spoke of unfinished things, not regrets exactly, but moments left incomplete, paths that had been interrupted before they could reach their natural end. And yet there was no bitterness in it. Only a calm acceptance that those moments had found a way to continue, even if it took years, even if it required a signal sent into silence and a dog that knew how to hear it. Ethan's breathing deepened, his shoulders easing in a way they had not in a long time. And as the final lines of the message came through, clearer than anything before them, he understood what this had always been about. It was not about discovery, not about uncovering something hidden for the sake of knowing, but about closure, about bringing something to rest that had never fully been allowed to settle. The voice slowed, then softened, the static beginning to return in gentle waves, not cutting it off, but carrying it away in the same quiet manner it had arrived, and Ethan remained there, listening until the last trace of it faded completely, leaving behind a silence that no longer felt heavy or uncertain, but complete. Rex let out a soft breath beside him, lowering himself onto the ground, his body finally relaxing, his ears settling back into a natural position, and Ethan sat back slightly, his hand still resting on the radio, his gaze steady but distant, as if he were looking not at the room, but through it, beyond it, to a place that had finally found its way back to him. And in that quiet stillness, he understood that some messages are not meant to change the world, only to bring peace to the ones who were meant to hear them. For a long moment after the signal faded, Ethan did not move, his hand still resting on the radio, as if letting go too quickly might undo something that had just finally been set right. And the silence that followed was no longer heavy or uncertain but gentle, almost protective, like a quiet hand placed over a wound that had already begun to heal. The room felt different now, not because anything had changed physically, but because whatever had lingered here before had found its way to completion, and Ethan could feel it in the way his breath came easier, in the way his shoulders no longer carried the same invisible weight they had when he first stepped into this house. Rex shifted beside him, lowering himself fully onto the ground. His body relaxed in a way that had not been possible before, his ears resting back in a calm, natural position. And for the first time since this began, he closed his eyes briefly, as if confirming that whatever he had sensed was now at peace. Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting across the small room one more time, taking in the table, the objects, the careful arrangement that no longer felt like something waiting to be discovered, but something that had already fulfilled its purpose. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the folded paper again, smoothing it gently between his fingers, reading the lines once more, and now the meaning felt clearer, not because the words had changed, but because he had. What once felt like a puzzle now felt like a message that had already been answered. He placed the paper back where it had been, next to the radio, not as something abandoned, but as something returned to its place. And then he picked up the metal tag one last time, holding it in the light for a brief moment before setting it down beside the others, completing the quiet circle that had been left open for so long. Above them, the faint sound of rain had softened, no longer a steady tapping but a gentle drift, as if the night itself had begun to settle, and Ethan stood slowly, his movements unhurried, grounded, no longer driven by the need to understand, but by the quiet certainty that he already did. He turned toward the ladder, placing one hand on the first rung, then paused, looking back over his shoulder at the room one final time, not out of doubt, but out of acknowledgement, a silent recognition of what had taken place here and what it had meant. Rex stood as well, stretching lightly before moving to the base of the ladder, ready to follow, his presence steady as always, and together they began the slow climb back up, step by step, leaving the space not as strangers who had stumbled into something hidden, but as those who had been meant to find it and carry its meaning forward. When Ethan stepped back into the room above, the air felt warmer, lighter, as if the house itself had released something it had been holding on to for years, and he moved to the closet, pausing only briefly before lowering the board back into place, not sealing it away, but restoring it, allowing the space beneath to return to its quiet rest. Rex stepped out beside him, glancing once toward the door before turning away, his attention no longer fixed there, and Ethan understood that the pull that had drawn them to this moment was gone, not because it had faded, but because it had been fulfilled. He walked back into the main room, the soft glow of the lamp still casting its quiet light across the space, and for the first time since he arrived, the house did not feel temporary, did not feel like a place to pass through, but like somewhere he could stay without carrying everything with him. He sat down slowly, resting his hands against his knees, and Rex settled at his feet, his presence calm, steady, complete, and in that quiet moment, with the rain easing outside and the night settling into stillness, Ethan realized that some things are not meant to be found quickly or easily, but are left behind with care, waiting for the right person to listen long enough to hear what was always there. And when they do, what they find is not just a secret, but a sense of peace that had been waiting just as patiently for them to return.